Well, hello, friends. I'm Tim Carter, the creator of the Blood and Leather podcast, and I want to take this opportunity to welcome you to episode 7. I created this podcast to take a deeper dive into the events that help shape the development of the United States. We will go beyond the United States from time to time, so be prepared for that. But I want to tell stories that dive into the events, the characters, the interconnected nature of what led to the settlement of the Americas. History is really one long story, and if we dig deep enough, we find those connections, often that we've never heard about. And that's what I love about it. I hope you will follow along and enjoy these stories, and I envision this as a chance for us to talk about these things as though we were sitting around a campfire somewhere and just sharing stories. So I hope you enjoy this visit with me here in episode 7, Hunt's Brutal Trek Across Idaho and Oregon. Now, this is the 7th episode of the podcast, and this is the one in which Hunt's expedition is going to be splintered into separate groups. In this episode, they are just trying to survive. So in the past, we saw them move up the Missouri River and across the plains east of the Rocky Mountains. But here, things take a different turn. Some of these men will successfully reach Astoria. Others are going to be left along the way, and still others die. So it's important that we kind of follow this along. In episode 6, as I said, we followed the Pacific Fur Company's overland expedition to the shadow of the Grand Tetons. Episode 4, we covered the seagoing expedition with the Tonkin, the ship the Tonkin, and the settlement of what became Astoria, the building of Fort Astoria. So, episode 6, we talked about the expedition coming to the foot of the Grand Tetons. Lots of challenges along the way, keeping his folks motivated, leading his people, which is the most difficult thing you can do as a human being, is to get people to work in unison. And there were lots of challenges for Wilson Price Hunt. Securing enough horses to make his overland trek easier was very difficult, but by the time Hunt arrived in the shadow of the Grand Tetons, he had pretty much everything he needed to make the remainder of his trek to Astoria, to what is now Astoria, Oregon. But the one thing he didn't have was information. He didn't know what he was facing with any degree of certainty. Now, he was in Jackson, Wyoming, what would become Jackson, Wyoming, in that valley in September 1811. And he found it very difficult to get any sort of information on what he could expect west of the Rocky Mountains. So we're going to talk about that in quite a bit of detail today. Now, we're going to take a deep dive into Hunt's journey across Teton Pass down into Pierre's Hole. And if his men thought that the journey had been hard, well, they're going to find out very soon that the real problem started right there along the banks of the Snake River in Idaho. So hang on. Just as with the last episode, I'd be willing to bet that you've never heard this story. And if you've heard some of it, you've certainly never heard it quite as I'm going to relate it today. It's one that I think is worth hearing. And again, I use Washington Irving's book, Astoria, as the chief resource, although I will be pulling information from other sources as well where appropriate. I'm ready to tell the story. Can't wait to get into it, so let's get started. Late September 1824. They'd made it to the Rocky Mountains, the barrier between the Great Plains and what we now call the Great Basin, an enormous tract of land that stretches from Baja California through California itself, Nevada, Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, and ultimately into Oregon. This area was created when the Earth's crust pulled apart over the last 30 million years, and it could be described as a desolate and barren region. The process of pulling apart thins the Earth's crust, so it causes parts of the crust to tilt and break off along fault lines. And we're very familiar with fault lines when we think of, well, California. Numerous fault lines run all across California. The mountains on either side of the Great Basin were created as a result of this action, the spreading action that we talked about, the pulling apart. And the many fault lines located around the Great Basin, along with the multitude of earthquakes that happen in those areas as well, can be attributed to the same type of geologic action. One other thing that makes the Great Basin interesting, it is the largest contiguous endorheic watershed in North America. Now, if you don't know what endorheic means, that puts you and me in the same scenario here, because I did not understand what endorheic was until I did some research on it. And it simply means that water that drains into that basin doesn't come back out. It doesn't drain back out through any other waterway. It doesn't empty into an ocean anywhere else. It is caught and it is kept in the Great Basin. And in the Great Basin, in the western U.S., in many places, the water flows down from higher elevations. It flows from springs. It flows from snowmelt. It flows into the drier, more arid areas, and ultimately it might sink down into the desert. And now that's an interesting thing. Coming from the eastern U.S., I'd never even thought about a sink, an area where water would disappear into the ground. It could happen in other places in the eastern U.S. I haven't really researched it, but I would say that it's not a very common process. Almost everything is running downhill, and it's running downhill pretty fast, and it makes its way to an ocean somewhere, ultimately. So if we think about this, another defining characteristic of the Great Basin is simply the desolation, the appearance of desolation that we see. A lot of the area in the basin is desert, and the landscape is rugged. There's a lot of sagebrush in many areas as well. So it doesn't look hospitable to civilization. Although they didn't know it, this is what Hunt's party was facing as they rested in the shadow of the Grand Tetons, one of the most beautiful places on Earth. The men camped in the Green River Valley near the Grand Tetons for 5 days, and the hunters hunted buffalo. The Canadian voyagers dried the meat for the trip ahead. The horses, which had been pretty hard used in crossing the prairies, they were allowed to graze and recover their strength. The men who weren't working to hunt or preserve food were able to relax and help to kind of rejuvenate themselves. Now, if we're honest, the Jackson Hole area is beautiful country, the Green River Valley all the way up through Jackson Hole into Yellowstone Park. And it's difficult to imagine a better, more beautiful place than what they were experiencing at that moment. They had come through some difficult country. The Great Plains and some of the barren landscapes they had already traversed showed them how difficult things started to show them how difficult things might be. They had some much more difficult territory ahead, and I might have been tempted to just stay right there in the Green River Valley or in the shadow of the Grand Tetons. Now, while out hunting one day, some of the hunters happened upon a small band of Indians who ran away as soon as they saw the white men. They didn't know what the white men wanted, and they weren't willing to stay and find out. Hunt and some of the others rode out to the area, and they found some Indian hunters having a buffalo hunt with their bows and arrows. The white men arrived and broke up the hunt and sent both buffalo and Indian in different directions. So Hunt and his men chased after them and finally overtook 2 young men who were certain that they would be killed on the spot, and were astonished to find that they were actually going to be treated well. Given their level of surprise, this may have been the first time that these boys had seen a white man. And finally, Hunt was able to calm them down, was able to sort things out, and he found out that this group of Indians was from the Snake tribe, having crossed into the valley on an annual buffalo hunt. When the boys were convinced that the men meant them no harm, they took them back to their village. And so our story kind of gets started here. While the young boys might never have seen white men, some of the warriors in the Snake camp had, and overall Hunt and his men experienced what they would call a joyful reception. As was the custom, the men were welcomed into the Snake lodges, and food was prepared and presented to them. And I've mentioned before in earlier episodes that it was the custom of the tribes to feed visitors. If you arrived, you were going to be fed. And it was also their custom that if you were fed, you ate what you were given, or you at least took it with you. You didn't refuse it. You didn't leave it behind. That was in poor taste. So you had to be sure that you ate. Having successfully hunted buffalo and preserved the meat, the Snake could trade some of the fruits of their labor, and Hunt needed some supplies. So Hunt and the party traded, and they had enough meat now to load each horse other than those ridden by the partners, and also Pierre Dorian's wife. Hunt traded for some beaver furs and let the Snakes know that a few of his men would be staying in the mountains to trap. The Snakes were welcome to trap as well, and their beaver pelts could then be traded with the Pacific Fur Company representatives who were surely going to return to the area in the future. So he was establishing this pattern of informing the natives that, hey, we're going to be back and we're going to trade for beaver fur. If you will go hunt and get some prepared, we'll be able to buy those from you or trade for those from you whenever we come back. Finally, there were enough supplies to move forward, and the season was getting pretty late. Hunt broke camp on September 24th and headed north up the valley towards modern-day Jackson, Wyoming. They rode along a river that Hoback recognized, the same river that is named for him today. And remember, Hoback was one of the three, Robinson, Hoback, and Resner, three Kentuckians who joined the party back along the Missouri River. The going was going to be difficult. The men and horses had to climb up and over rocky outcroppings and cliffs. Some of the horses were heavily loaded with supplies, and they fell on this rough, jumbled ground. One horse tumbled 200 feet down and into the river, and remarkably was not injured. Now, this river ran into the Columbia, the river flowing north and west to the Pacific. At the time, essentially every river that became a tributary to the Columbia might have been called the Columbia. So it didn't matter what we call the river today. At that time in history, if it emptied into the Columbia River at some point, it would have likely been called the Columbia, even far upstream. Now we know that what Hunt called Columbia was actually the Snake River. And when Hunt's party reached the confluence of the Hoback and the Snake, the men named the combined river the Mad River, so named because of the severity and strength of the rushing water, the rapids, and the area around the river. Camp was set up, and the men knew that the Tetons, or the Pilot Knobs, as Hunt called them, well, they lay just ahead. From Robinson, Hoback, and Resner, Hunt knew that the Mad River ran to the Pacific Ocean. Now the question was, could they build some boats and float down the river all the way to the Pacific, much like they would have done on the Missouri had they been headed back east? The boatmen were excited that there was a possibility of this. I mean, if you think about this, as the Canadian voyagers made their way west, when they left the Missouri River, their level of comfort was dramatically diminished. They were no longer in their element. Now they had a chance to think about being back in their element, back on a river, headed back downstream where their skills became more important. And they were excited about this possibility. I'm sure everybody was excited thinking about this, because going downstream in a canoe is much faster and easier than traveling overland. And if you think about this, there's the idyllic version of sitting in a canoe floating tranquilly downstream. And if they could do that, the hardest part of their journey was going to be over. So the rest of the trip would be a lot easier for them if this were possible. If they could float down the Mad River, the Snake, all the way to the Columbia. And you know, as Gilligan once said to the skipper, from here on out, it looks like smooth sailing. Now, it was on the banks of the Mad River that Hunt consulted with the other partners. They discussed their next move at this time. They'd reached a river, the water from which would ultimately empty into the Pacific Ocean at Astoria. But what lay between? Would the incredible power and the multitude of rocks and rapids on the Mad River mean that the river was unnavigable? Robinson, Hoback, and Resner knew of the pass through the mountains, but they were not experts on the nature of the river itself. Would there be rapids? If so, would they be severe enough to require portage? What about waterfalls? What was the terrain like? Would the natives be warlike? Would there be food enough to sustain them? Just how far would they have to go? What would be the best route for them to take? Now, these were all significant questions, and where there is ignorance, there is often unrealistic optimism. If not, we would likely never venture into the really difficult situations, because the potential for bad things to happen would be far too great. There's a great saying that fits perfectly here: ignorance is bliss. On the other hand, ignorance can be very costly. It can get you killed. So the result of their discussions, Hunt and his partners, we might have been able to predict. These men had traveled up the Missouri in a manner that, while difficult in its own way, was nothing like traveling across the plains. Now they knew that they would be heading downstream with the flow of the current, and their thinking was that this had to be better than traveling horseback across the mountains and across the country on the western range. To quote Washington Irving, the vote, as might have been expected, was almost unanimous for embarkation, for when men are in difficulties, every change seems to be for the better. Now, if we're honest, you and I will admit that change is not always good. Of course, there is positive transformational change, the kind of change that is needed to advance and place yourself in a better position for the future. But there's also negative and destructive change, the kind of change that leaves you in a worse spot than you were, with less reserves and less motivation. Change for the sake of change is almost never a good choice, and it was time to find out just what sort of change these men were facing. It was now that Hunt put his men to work searching for and felling trees suitable for making the boats they would need to travel down the Mad River, the Snake, to the Columbia. Meanwhile, Hunt, who himself harbored doubts about the correctness of the decision to sail downriver, he sent John Reed, John Day, and Pierre Dorian, 3 men whose judgment he thoroughly trusted, downstream to recon the river and to determine if moving downstream by boat would be advisable. With these activities moving forward, Hunt now started thinking about the rich beaver streams in the area. In theory, these streams were far inland and separated from the headwaters of the Missouri, so they would be unmolested by trappers. Beaver sign in the area showed that this could be a profitable trapping ground, and Hunt sent Alexander Carson, Louis Saint-Michel, Pierre Détaille, and Pierre Delaunay out to trap. Trappers normally trapped in pairs to divide the labor and provide some company for each other, as well as protecting each other while they were engaged actively in the work. Carson and Saint-Michel were one team, Détaille and Delaunay were another. The men were given ammunition, traps, horses, and other supplies they were going to need, and then they were sent out to the upper Mad River and the tributaries to the upper Mad River to begin harvesting furs. They'd be gone for months, and of course, Hunt and the expedition would be long gone in a few days, so the men were given instructions on how to proceed when they trapped enough furs to transport them out. Now, I want you to pay particular attention to these instructions because I don't know if I've ever heard more general instructions on anything. Once the men trapped enough, whatever that means, they were to pack their horses and find the best way possible to reach the mouth of the Columbia River or any other American Fur Company post established along the way. There. Easy enough, right? Now, those are simple, clear, and concise instructions. No problem. Go trap for as long as it takes and then find your way to the Pacific Ocean however you can. Washington Irving compared this to setting a sailor adrift on the sea behind a ship. Again, I marvel at the willingness of men to simply do these things. And these 4 men set off into the wilderness to find whatever might come. Shortly after those 4 trappers left the camp, 2 Snake Indians wandered in and looked around incredulously. It was clear the men were building boats, and the Snakes just couldn't believe it. Shaking their heads, they made it clear that there was no way that boats could be taken downriver. Though some of the men laughed, the opinions of the Snakes were confirmed when Reed, Day, and Dorian returned from their reconnaissance after several days. They had traveled downstream through rough country for the first 2 days and finally climbed a rock outcropping, only to see miles and miles of rough country broken with rocks and rapids ahead of them. The channel was narrow, which meant it was fast-moving and deep. The rocks in the stream bed made for dangerous rapids and numerous waterfalls at places where the elevation changed dramatically and very quickly. Building boats and sailing downriver was simply not going to work, and the idea would have to be abandoned. Now, at this point, it was clear to Hunt and almost everyone else that they wouldn't be able to use the Mad River for travel, and they'd need to find another stream somewhere ahead. I say almost everyone else because Joseph Miller, a partner in the expedition since St. Louis, he was so worn out by the land travel that he was willing to risk everything to travel downriver by boat. Simply put, Miller was over it. He had a negative attitude. It was possibly caused by a health problem that made the horseback riding especially difficult for him. He had also come to understand that although he was a partner, he had a smaller stake in the enterprise than his fellow partners. He was in a bad place physically, mentally, and certainly emotionally, and so he was unstable and difficult to deal with. So the decision was made to continue overland despite his protests. Robinson, Hoback, and Resner now told Hunt that his best bet would be to head to Henry's Fort on Henry's Fork of the Snake River. They had been at the fort with Henry, and they knew that they had to be close. In fact, they thought that by crossing the pass in the mountains, what we now know as Teton Pass, they would drop down into the valley where the fort was located. From there, they assured Henry that the river was navigable by canoes, not that they really knew what the river looked like farther downstream. We need to keep this in mind. Now, when they dropped over Teton Pass and dropped down into the valley on the western side of the Grand Tetons, they were in a place that would come to be known as Pierre's Hole. So this will come up later in a future episode, but just wanted to point that out to you as well. Now, it was clear that sailing downriver wasn't going to be possible, and it was time to think about the overland journey. The two Snake warriors knew where Henry's Fort was located, and they offered to guide the party to it, an offer that was accepted. The weather had turned nasty with storms and heavy rains falling around the camp. The Rocky Mountain storms were violent, often with straight-line winds, likely what we might now call a microburst, that would knock down trees in great patches, making a jumble of trunks and branches almost impossible to navigate. If you've ever been to the Rocky Mountains, you might have seen whole swaths of forest that were laid down, and acres of forest. So that's the type of thing we're talking about here. The rain fell heavy in the valley, but on the high mountains it wasn't rain. The moisture came down in the form of snow. Hunt broke camp on October 4th, crossing the Mad River and camping overnight at the foot of Teton Pass. After 4 more days of travel, they reached Henry's Fort on October 8th. It was a blustery day with snow flurries driven by the westerly winds. Now, we need to recall that Hunt had left Manuel Lisa waiting at the Arikara village, expecting Henry to descend the Missouri at just about any time. In fact, Henry had left the fort in the spring, and he did rejoin Lisa on the Missouri River. Hunt and his party found Henry's Fort deserted. There's an old saying, any port in a storm, and I'm sure that Henry's Fort looked a lot more civilized than anything these men had seen since leaving the Omaha area. Built on the banks of a wide, shallow river, which would later be called Henry's Fork of the Snake, the fort consisted of log huts. Here, Henry's Fork was smooth-flowing and wide, and it appeared that the assurances of Robinson, Hoback, and Resner were justified. With timber aplenty in the surrounding forests, Hunt once again put his men to work building canoes for the trip downriver. The expedition was rich in horses now, having 121 at last count, and Hunt would need to figure out how to deal with those horses upon embarking with the canoes. He decided that the best course of action was to establish the first Rocky Mountain outpost of the Pacific Fur Company right here. From here, the trappers who would be dispersed in the mountains, along with the Indians who were already in the mountain valleys, they could come to trade their furs for trade goods brought back from Astoria. Any parties traveling back and forth across the Rockies could use the post to resupply, and it could provide a nice stopping-off point for parties traveling in either direction. The plan makes sense if you have the right people and the right number of people running the trading post. Hunt told the two Snake warrior guides about his plans for the post, and he hired them to stay in the area and care for the horses until the overland party returned eastward. He promised that they would be compensated for their work and for honestly caring for the property of the company. If you think that leaving the horses at an abandoned fur outpost on the frontier with 2 Indians you barely know seems risky, well, you're 100% correct. But the truth was, there really wasn't anything else he could do. He had either to take the horses and travel overland to the Pacific coast, or he could abandon the horses and go downriver via canoe. But he couldn't do both. Since the decision was made to travel downriver, the horses were lost regardless of what else took place. His gamble was that the warriors might be able to keep some of the horses for any returning members of the Pacific Fur Company and or the trappers working in the area. So it was worth a try. It was while at Henry's Fort that another group of trappers set out to trap the area. Robinson, Hoback, and Resner, who had been with Henry here at the fort and had trapped the area before, they knew the country, and they were furnished with a complete outfit of horses, traps, ammunition, and anything else they might need. In exchange for the outfit, all they had to do was to bring all the pelts they could obtain either to Astoria or to Henry's Fort. That seemed simple enough, and accompanying the 3 Kentuckians was a hunter named Cass. Just as this group was about to leave, Joseph Miller, remember he was already disgruntled earlier, he called the partners together and he let them know that he planned to leave the party and accompany Robinson's group of trappers. Now everybody was shocked. Miller was not a frontiersman. He was not a trapper. And he was surrendering a share of the entire operation to earn a trapper's wages, only a portion of what he could be expected to earn otherwise. Hunt tried diligently to persuade Miller to change his mind, but it was to no avail. His mind was made up, and there was no point in arguing about it. One way or another, Miller was going to leave the party right here. There being no other recourse, Hunt and the other partners attempted to provide Miller with everything he might need, including 4 horses. The 2 Snake warriors agreed to take the 5 trappers to their village where they could get some information on the best trapping areas nearby. The 2 warriors would then return to Henry's Fort to oversee the 77 remaining horses until who knows when. The 5 trappers and their 2 guides left the party on October 10th, 1811, to see what their fate might be. As the men in Hunt's party continued to work on canoes, it became obvious that game was scarce in the valley. Buffalo sign was everywhere, but it was old, and there just were no buffalo in sight. They were able to kill a couple of elk and a few beavers over several days, and luckily they had dried buffalo meat to carry them through, but they didn't have much to spare. 15 canoes were completed by October 18th, and it was decided that the party would cast off the next day. They left everything they couldn't take on the banks of Henry's Fork, and downstream they went. Once again, the Canadian voyagers were in their element, and they enthusiastically picked up the paddles and joined together to sing the songs they had sung back on the Great Lakes. Soon the boats arrived at the confluence of Henry's Fork and the Mad River, the Snake. The combined rivers made for a large and smooth-flowing stream that meandered through the valley. Willow thickets and cottonwoods blanketed the banks of what was now called the Columbia, but would later be called the Snake River, and flocks of geese flying south, snow flurries, and cold weather proved that winter was coming to this part of the country. Easing smoothly down the river in relatively tranquil waters all seemed right with the world. After traveling overland through rough country at a slow pace, this leg of the journey must have seemed heaven-sent. Moving downstream required less effort, and spirits were high. I'll bet that the men thought it really would be smooth sailing from here on out. But, as always seems to happen, life just doesn't work out that way, and around each bend, there's another complication just waiting to challenge our resilience. The flotilla traveled 30 miles on the first day, pulling over to make camp near some willow thickets. One of the things we find in reading accounts from early explorers is that grizzly bears love willow thickets. In this case, Hunt's camp was in a place that was infested with grizzly bears, so the men were on constant alert and had a fitful night's rest that first night going downriver. The next day found the men floating down a wider river with a beautiful view of the Pilot Knobs, or the Grand Tetons, to the east. But the men noticed that here the river started to pick up some steam. The terrain was sloping more aggressively to the west, so the river was picking up speed as it flowed along over the next 20 miles at a faster pace than the previous day. Slowly, the character of the river started to change as well. There were more rapids, and there were larger rocks breaking the tranquility. Whitewater became more common, foaming and roaring as the men passed by on an ever more turbulent journey. It was here that the men noticed a substantive difference between the rivers that flow eastward out of the Rocky Mountains and those that flow to the west. The eastward flowing rivers have perhaps a more gradual decline over the plains, and they tend to flow more gently. Those flowing westward through the remnants of the mountains, which have been formed through tectonic plate shifts and violent volcanic eruptions, they tend to encounter terrain which, while beautiful to look at, have sudden elevation shifts, making conditions severe for any traveler seeking to follow the river's path. The men in Hunt's party now found themselves in rough water, with conditions deteriorating by the mile. 2 canoes were swamped by the whitewater, losing most of their cargo, though the men were saved. One canoe was completely lost when it floated downriver and broke up after hitting the large rocks downstream. Though the men who were living out these events didn't know the expression, things were about to get western. On October 21st, just 2 days of travel downstream from Henry's Fort, the men encountered a serious obstacle. The river narrowed considerably as it entered a gorge, huge rock walls standing tall on either side and forcing the water through the center. The river, which had been over 100 yards wide upstream, was now, for a distance of about a half mile, reduced to about 20 yards wide. The water, roaring violently through the rapids that were created with the force of the flowing water, encountering immovable rocks in the riverbed. There was no way to move the canoes safely through those rapids, so the men were reduced to using a line fed from the rock embankments, which would allow the canoes to pass downriver slowly. No sooner had they navigated this treacherous stretch than they found another set of rapids, which required a portage of quite some distance to move both canoes and cargo around. The Canadian voyagers again proved their mettle and their worth by eagerly shouldering loads and setting off across the rough and rocky ground to the next embarkation point, all with good humor, jokes, and laughter. Yet it was clear that the nature of the journey was becoming something other than the men had believed it would be. Their original elation at embarking on a journey downriver to the Pacific was being slapped in the face with harsh reality. Just 2 days into the journey, things had become very difficult, and they'd no idea what lay farther downstream. Worry is a word that I think is overused today. After all, we all could worry about almost anything. I think worry is mostly a result of people thinking about the uncertainty of what might happen, and I'm sure that Hunt, his partners, and all the men in the party were thinking about what might happen in the coming days. I'm also sure that none of them had any idea of just how bad things were going to get. As the men floated downriver through the stretches that allowed easy navigation, they looked for native villages, hoping that they would find someone who could provide some intelligence on the prospects of floating down the river ahead. Yet no villages existed in these areas. Not one person was seen on the banks of the Snake River, and the men couldn't help but think about the severity of the rapids they might encounter around the next bend. They continued to float along, rapidly heading downstream and negotiating rapids that were frequent but not a serious threat to their safety. They floated occasionally through prairies that showed old buffalo sign and were filled with different varieties of birds, beaver, and prickly pear plants. They'd traveled about 280 miles downriver without seeing anyone. They'd floated through a variety of landscapes, all devoid of human habitation, and almost without any animal life. Finally, on October 24th, they saw a small village on the riverbanks and steered over to pay the tribe a visit. Now, this was all well and good, except the Indians ran away as the men approached. All signs indicated that this was a band of Shoshones moving through the area and camped here only for a short time. Hunt's men found fish, roots, seeds, and grain, all being dried and stored to provide food for the coming winter. The tribe had no tools to speak of, but did have some bows and arrows made from pine, cedar, and bone, with arrowheads made of green stones. Handmade vessels, made of willow and grass woven so tightly that they could hold water, were also in the camp. The white men bothered nothing and left a couple of knives as gifts before they left to embark once again on the river. Shortly after leaving the village, the men met 3 members of the Snake tribe on a raft made of reeds. These men were naked except for rabbit-skin cloaks worn over the shoulders. The men moved away and would not allow the canoes to approach them for a talk, so the idea was abandoned. It was becoming clear that the average native on the western edge of the Rocky Mountains wanted nothing to do with the white men. Traveling downriver, Hunt once again encountered rough water. In fact, a 30-foot waterfall blocked their easy descent of the river, leading the men to go ashore and make camp. The next day, the men had to portage the canoes and goods downriver, but continued to encounter rapids that required a great deal of time to navigate. Other snake camps were discovered, but in each instance, the tribe abandoned the village and fled before anyone could speak with them. Hunt knew that the thing he needed most was intelligence. He needed to know what to expect on the Snake River farther downstream, but he wasn't having any success at all in making contact with the natives who had that information. Every effort was made to call back a member of the tribe to have a conversation, and finally one man did come back riding a horse. Filled with fear, this man trembled as he approached. He appeared to be better off than most other natives that the group had encountered. He was better fed and better dressed, but it was soon evident that the man had an agenda of his own. Hunt wanted information, and this man wanted food. Specifically, he wanted the white men to leave his store of dried meat and salmon, which he had left stored in the camp, alone. He had little enough food for the coming winter and could afford to lose none of it. Hunt did manage to trade a few knives for a small portion of the stored food, but he was never able to get any sort of response to his questions, and he and his men moved on downriver. Oh, the days when the men traveled 30 miles in a day were wonderful, and by now they were a memory. The difficult terrain, rapids, waterfalls, portages, and hard physical labor meant that in the next 2 days the expedition only traveled about 8 miles. On October 28th, things took a decided turn for the worse. The river, much rougher than even on recent days, became a constant barrage of whitewater rapids. Only the skilled work of the voyagers kept any of the canoes safe. Ramsay Crooks, riding in the second canoe in the flotilla, watched the first canoe pass through a passage safely, but recognized that his canoe, steered by Antoine Clapin, was headed towards the rock. Although he attempted to call out to Clapin, the noise of the churning river must have made it impossible to hear the warning, and the canoe hit the rock, split, and dumped all 5 men overboard. Crooks and 1 man struck out for the shore and made it safely. Clapin and 2 other men managed to hold the remnants of the canoe until it struck another rock, whipping around and throwing Clapin into the river, where he was swept downstream and never seen again. The other 2 men managed to make it to shore, but all were aware that they themselves had almost suffered the fate of Clapin. Though they didn't know it yet, the men had entered a particularly treacherous stretch where the river entered a pass between 200-foot-high walls and was reduced to a 30-foot-wide channel. It was immediately clear that they could go no further in their canoes. They were at a standstill, and they knew it. This stretch of the river, near modern-day Murtaugh, Idaho, was given the name the Cauldron Linn, after a waterfall in Scotland of the same name. The river now disappeared through the channel, roaring downstream and over a waterfall. Moving overland by horseback was starting to look pretty enticing. Yes, moving overland was starting to have a great deal of appeal, and as the men sat on the banks of the river, they discussed their options. Losing a man took a toll on the high spirits they had enjoyed in previous days. Clapin had been an experienced and very capable man, and if he could be killed, so could anyone else. They took stock of their situation now. In an earlier episode, I referred to Jocko Willink's contention that the most important thing on the battlefield is your own position. Hunt and his men knew approximately where they were, but they didn't know what they faced ahead. They needed to honestly appraise where they were and what they could reasonably expect in the future. They had traveled 340 miles in the 10 days since they had left Henry's Fort. They'd made good time early in the adventure, but the last few days had been difficult and slow. Now they'd lost a total of 2 canoes and 1 man. Everyone was thinking the same thing. Although difficult to admit, they might have to abandon the canoes here and set off overland. Knowledge is power, and Hunt needed information, so he decided to send exploring parties, one on either side of the river, downstream to find some answers. The next morning, 3 men set off down the south bank of the river, while Hunt and 3 others set off down the north bank. When both parties returned, it was not with a joyous announcement of discovery. Instead, both parties acknowledged that they had explored nearly 40 miles and found that the river flowed through a deep gorge worn into the rocks over the years. The gorge was about 30 yards wide at the widest places, with canyon walls towering 200 and 300 feet overhead. In these areas, it was impossible to get down to or back up from the river. They had encountered a jumble of rocks and boulders, swamps, waterfalls, and obstructions of every kind. There was one slim ray of hope when the explorers on the south side of the river explained that they had found a place about 6 miles downriver where they thought it was possible to launch canoes and head downriver, although additional portages would be required below that. Grasping at any possibility to keep the party moving downstream, it was decided to send 4 of the best canoes down to the location, 16 men carrying them on their shoulders, and launch them from there. Mr. Reed, the clerk, set off with 3 men to explore even further downstream, looking out for Indians who might have food, information, and perhaps even horses should the men be forced to abandon the river and head overland once more. The next day, the options were narrowed when the party of voyagers who had been sent to launch the 4 canoes returned. While passing the canoes downriver through a rapids by line, they had lost one of them, and along with it the weapons and personal property of the 4 voyagers who had manned it. The other 3 canoes each ran aground hard between rocks in the stream and couldn't be recovered. The dejected men all agreed that the river could not be navigated. It was time for a different plan. As I reread this passage of Irving's book while working on a summary of the events, I was reminded of a passage I read this morning over my first cup of coffee. Now, as leaders, we don't have the luxury of waiting until we have all of the information we need to make a perfect decision. In fact, there really is no such thing as a perfect decision. We take imperfect information and we make the best decisions we can. Then we deal with the issues that present themselves and make yet other decisions. I've recently become a fan of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who had this to say about indecision. Each indecision brings its own delays, and days are lost lamenting over lost days. What you can do or think you can do, begin it. for boldness has magic, power, and genius in it. I like that quote a lot. And I think what we find is that waiting just causes more worry and more indecision. We have to actually start doing something based upon our best information. And now was the time for a decision of some sort. Here they sat 340 miles from the nearest place with which they had any certainty. They didn't know precisely how much farther they had to travel downstream. They'd no idea what the conditions would be, either via water or over land. The miles between them and Astoria were, to them and any other white men they knew, unexplored. There was no information whatever for them to access. They'd lost canoes and their stock of food to the point that they now had enough food for only 5 days. Starving was beginning to look like a real possibility. Staying together offered some security because there's strength in numbers, but it also increased the probability that all of them would starve together before they reached their destination. And so they decided it was time to split up. Here is where the expedition splintered into separate small subgroups. 3 partners were to each take a small group of men and head off in different directions, looking for friendly Indians, food, horses, and or anything else which might be useful to the expedition. If they found something that would suffice for everybody, they were to return to the main group. But if not, they were to fend for themselves and make their way to Astoria in the most expeditious manner. I don't know about you, but that sounds an awful lot like you are on your own. After the miles and months of hardship, Calder Lynn had been the breaking point. The leaders didn't know exactly what to do. Leadership is all about making tough decisions with incomplete and inaccurate information. You do the best you can, but there's no way to have all the information that you need. Now, without some insight as to the best path forward, risking everyone to pursue one chosen path wasn't really an ideal option. The 3 parties were led by McClellan, Crooks, and McKenzie. McClellan took 3 men and headed downriver along the banks that had previously been explored, but he was intent on going farther. Crooks took 5 men and headed back upriver, intent on going all the way back to Henry's Ford if necessary to find supplies and horses. Now, I can't imagine the thoughts that went through the minds of the men as they headed back, thinking about the potential of backtracking all the way 340 miles to the fort they'd left behind. Mackenzie, meanwhile, took 5 men and headed north across the desolate landscape between the Snake River and the Sawtooth National Forest. In the days before irrigation, this was a barren landscape with nothing much to recommend it. Nevertheless, north and west lay the Columbia River, and it was in this direction that Mackenzie took his men. Now Hunt had to take care of the remaining 34 members of his expedition, including Pierre Dorian's pregnant wife, Marie, and their 2 children. Though there was little food in the area, the members of the expedition drew some comfort from the optimistic hope that one or more of the exploring parties would return with good news. As Francis Bacon once said, hope is a good breakfast, but it's a bad supper. And nobody knew this more than Hunt. Nevertheless, it was all they had: hope, muscles, and daylight. There was work to do. The expedition had been loaded down with provisions and trade goods, many of which were still being transported in the canoes. But now it was decided to cache these items so that they could travel light. In today's computer, internet, Wi-Fi, AI-dominant world, the term cache means computer memory, which allows storage of bits which can be accessed quickly at high speed. Cache, as defined by the French who brought the term to prominence, by the mountain men and by the men in Hunt's party, meant a hidden storage area built to temporarily and safely store items that could not be carried any farther. As noted by Washington Irving, all migratory tribes have no other method of saving anything that they can't carry, so a cache, although not known by that name, was used by the tribes of the American West. It was common to store furs, merchandise, and even food for later retrieval, and Hunt knew that his party needed to make good time while expending as little energy as possible. Replacing the calories they burned would not be easy. Caching your merchandise and baggage sounds easy, but if you've ever dug a hole by hand, you know it's a great deal of work. Selection of the best place was the first priority. The location had to be memorable and easily recognizable so that it was easily found. It was often near a stream in a low-lying area, and the reason for that will become clear shortly. Once the location was identified, blankets or some other cover was spread on the ground so that dirt dug from the cache could be placed upon them. Other covers were placed over all the nearby vegetation to prevent trampling, which would easily give away the location. Next, a sod circle, perhaps 2 feet in diameter, was cut out and placed aside to be reinstalled later. Digging directly down commenced, with the hole becoming wider as it was deepened to a depth of 7 feet or so. The hole now would have looked a lot like a pyramid with the small opening at the top. Any dirt removed from the hole would differ from that on the surface, so care had to be taken to place this dirt only on the coverings for disposal later. Now the outer edges of the hole were lined with dry grass, bark, sticks, poles for support, and skins when available and where necessary. Everything that was to be cached was then deposited into the hole and covered with a hide. Dried grass, brush, stones, and other fill materials were placed atop the stored items and trampled to compact them as much as possible. Loose dirt from the blankets was added to finish filling the hole, and water was often sprinkled to help solidify that dirt. Finally, when the hole was filled to the top, the sod which had been cut out earlier was replaced with special care to leave the area appearing as it had before any digging was done. Replacing fallen trees or stones was critical, because making the area look undisturbed was absolutely essential. Any remaining loose dirt was thrown into the stream so that it was easily dispersed. If there was no stream nearby, the dirt was carried away and spread thinly over some distant area. Blankets were removed from the vegetation, and every effort was made to leave the appearance that no one had even been in the area, so that any roving band of Indians would not find the cache and take everything. According to Washington Irving, 4 men could cache 3 tons of merchandise in 2 days. Hunt's expedition needed 9 caches to store all their merchandise. And if you think any of that sounds easy, maybe you ought to try it sometime. 3 days after he left to search for food and horses, Crook's party returned to Hunt's camp. Now, everyone in camp at first assumed that this was a good sign. Surely relief was at hand. But they soon learned that Crook had done some calculations after heading back to Henry's Fort. Given the distance and the difficulties they faced in heading back overland, Crooks had determined that he could not reach Henry's Fork and make it back to Hunt's camp before springtime. Now, it seems to me that these calculations might have been done prior to walking away from the camp in the first place. But that's just me thinking out loud. Still, having thought this through more carefully, Crooks had decided to return to the camp and figure out what came next together. Hunt now knew that the only real hope for assistance lay with McClellan's party, which had headed downriver. Mackenzie would have a difficult time making his way north and west, and it was not expected that any help would come from his group. So Hunt and his party waited, trapping and fishing with modest results, while hoping to see someone appear from downriver with good news. Finally, 2 men did appear from downstream, and once again the initial joy at the prospects of their return was dashed to pieces with a dose of reality. They'd gone farther downriver than the earlier expedition with the same results. They'd found no Indian camps, and the river continued to run between towering cliffs over whitewater rapids and down waterfalls. Forlorn and with a degree of disgust, the men named the area the Devil's Scuttle Hole and began to think about what to do next. It was clear that the groups who had been sent out would not come back with any form of aid because there simply wasn't any possibility that they would find anything substantive in their travels. The expedition members knew they were on their own now, and they knew that they had to start walking. They didn't yet know precisely how far they were from Astoria, but they were about 1,000 miles from their destination. Winter was upon them, and every single aspect of their existence from here on would be guesswork. As Washington Irving points out, setting out on foot wasn't going to be easy. The landscape between the Snake River and the Columbia is largely desert with sand and rock aplenty, but little water or vegetation other than around the streams and in the mountains to the north and east. Of course, the Blue Mountains, which they would have to cross in northeast Oregon, presented areas in which they could find food and water, but they also represented a substantial barrier. The men didn't even know any of this when they set out, however. Because Hunt and the partners could see the landscape north of them, they knew that they wouldn't be passing through a Garden of Eden, and they decided to stick close to the Snake River so that they could at least have water and perhaps the occasional fish. This course of action also presented the best opportunity for meeting any tribes of Indians who might be camped in the area. They would also need the water, so camps and villages should be close to the Snake. When the expedition set off from Cauldron Lynn, they had 40 pounds of Indian corn, 20 pounds of grease, 5 pounds of portable soup, and enough dried meat to give each man 5 pounds for the entirety of their journey, with 1/4 pound reserved for emergencies. I wondered just when they might declare their situation to be an emergency. Everything else that they didn't need to take with them was deposited in the caches. Each man now carried about 20 pounds of weight besides his personal kit. As they walked along, they found very few places where they could climb down to the river's edge. Now, if you're like me and you try to analyze what might have been the best course of action, you can quickly realize that there's little benefit to attempting to stick to the riverbanks if you can't actually reach the river for water. Nevertheless, this was the best of a bad set of options, and they did what they could, often drinking rainwater that had been caught in the hollows of the rock they traversed. Let's take a second to look at the landscape they're traversing here as well. A quick look at the satellite imagery found on Google Maps or Google Earth shows the harsh environment. This area of Idaho, which is just beautiful today, is a remnant of long ago volcanic activity. Just north and slightly east of Cauldron Lynn lies the Craters of the Moon National Monument, an area of old lava flows, cinder cones, and sagebrush that stretches for miles across the barren countryside. It's likely that all you need to really know about the area is the name. After all, Craters of the Moon is a name that doesn't bring to mind a paradise. It is desolate, and looking at the satellite map today allows us to see the miles of barren countryside they traveled. Modern irrigation has stretched farming and the greenery associated with the crops for miles away from the river. But in 1811, none of this would have existed. On November 9th, 1811, the party split up. Finding food for one large party would be more difficult than finding food for two smaller parties, and by splitting up they could increase the odds of finding something better and perhaps assisting the other group. Hunt took 18 men along with Pierre Dorian and his young family and headed down the north side of the river. Ramsey Crooks took 18 men and headed down the south bank of the river, and off they went into the unknown. Now, I'm sure you've walked down riverbanks at some point. The river moves along smoothly and ripples at times over stones or speeds through rapids. Maybe you even encounter a small waterfall here and there. But in this case, the riverbanks were a huge gorge with steep cliffs hundreds of feet above the river itself on either side. To illustrate how high those cliffs are above the Snake River Gorge today, some people base jump. BASE is the acronym that represents buildings, antennas, spans, and earth. And people today base jump from bridges along the Snake River Canyon, parachuting down. So Hunt and Crooks and all the men were walking along the tops of these cliffs, looking down hundreds of feet to the river below, the river that they had thought would allow them to flow right down to the Columbia. Now, on their first day of overland travel, Hunt and his companions walked 28 miles. Now, let me ask a question. Have you ever walked 28 miles in a day? Me neither. But I have hiked about 13 miles in a day, and I can tell you, I was tired. Now, during their 28-mile trek, they couldn't find a path down to the river, so they walked along without water, too. They finally found a place that would allow them to make a very rough descent to the water, and they decided to camp right there. After a terribly difficult attempt, they finally retrieved one kettle of water to use in camp that night. They slept under rock outcroppings after a rainy day, so they were not enjoying their journey so far. The next day, 32 miles were covered, walking north and west parallel to the river, but only able to climb down to the water level one time. The volcanic rock and the channel carved through the rocky terrain were just too difficult to deal with. The next morning, they saw a path, well beaten, and leading down to the river. Horses had made this path, and they logically supposed an Indian camp had to be nearby. Heading back up the path, Hunt and his companions met two Shoshone Indians who approached carefully, holding up a knife to show that they had met other white men and traded with them. Hunt spent a bit of time trying to communicate with the men, and finally convinced them to take him back to their village. Up the trail they went, traveling quite a distance out onto the prairie, finally nearing a group of lodges made of straw and shaped like haystacks. This makes sense if we remember that the Buffalo of the Plains Indians were not prominent here in what would become Idaho. The tribes had to make do with materials which were easy to collect and work with. Straw it was, much like the adobe houses of the desert dwellers farther south, where straw and mud made up the adobe bricks. As with every other village the men had approached, on the west side of the Rocky Mountains, the villagers were scared. The women hid the children who were too small to run away under straw in the lodges and carried their infants across the prairie. The men waited with resignation and timidity, not knowing what to expect. Hunt entered the lodges and lifted the straw to look at the scared children. His friendly disposition soon broke the ice, and he was able to trade with the members of the tribe, bartering for dried salmon and a dog. It's important to remember that dog was one of the most common and preferred animals the Plains tribes kept for food. When you think about it, this makes perfect sense. At a time when storing food was difficult, the domesticated dog could be kept around until you needed it. Food mobility was no effort at all. No drying, no storage, no spoilage. For us in today's modern world, especially for a dog lover like myself, it's hard to accept it. But that was just the reality of things. Traveling downstream, the expedition soon entered and camped in a more populated area near a larger village. Members of the tribe visited Hunt's camp and were friendly. They seemed to be well-dressed and carried buffalo robes obtained via trade from the Plains tribes. Better off than the other smaller groups Hunt had encountered, this tribe had enough food to trade, and Hunt again bartered for 2 dogs, which provided breakfast for the expedition. Over 3 days, the expedition continued to travel northwest, following the course of the Snake River and covering over 60 miles. They encountered other natives who also lived in straw houses, although these tribes were not as alarmed as those encountered earlier. The Indians had caught and cured a considerable amount of salmon, as was evident by the salmon heads and tails which were piled around the village. The majority of this preserved food was buried underground, however, hidden from potential thieves. Hunt noticed that the women and children of these tribes were poorly clothed, wearing an odd mixture of skins and old buffalo robes, which, owing to the scarcity of any wild game in the area, had apparently been obtained through trade with the Plains tribes. One thing that did please Hunt was the presence of horses, the numbers of which seemed to grow the further west he traveled. The unmistakable stench of dead fish permeated the air as Hunt and his men traveled 28 miles downriver on November 15th. This stretch of river was serene in comparison to the miles they had already passed, with no rapids to speak of along the way. As they traveled, they encountered other tribes who told them that Reed's party had passed through a few days earlier. Although horses were present at these villages, none of the Indians wanted to trade, and instead took the horses away quickly to keep them from being stolen. Dog and salmon and not much more continued to be on the menu when they could get them. Sometimes they were reduced to eating dried meat and parched corn, food which was easily stored and transported, but definitely not a culinary delight. All of us have eaten beef jerky, and although they certainly didn't flavor the dried meat in this way, jerked meat was standard fare for these types of travelers. I've never had parched corn, but according to what I've read, it's made from toasting corn kernels until they are golden brown and crunchy, with a nutty and crisp texture. Now that sounds pretty good, actually. I suspect, like most high-carbohydrate food, there's likely some caramelization of the sugars as the corn is heated, which would make for a somewhat tastier treat. Still, it's not steak. The next day, the river's course ran through a narrow, rocky channel and was once again violently churned as a result. Making 20 miles on the 16th of November, they could see that they were approaching a snow-covered mountain which they had seen on the horizon for several days before. November 17th was notable because it offered the first opportunity to trade for a horse. Hunt knew that one pack horse could make a huge difference to the men who were weakened from hard travel and insufficient food. Horses being relatively scarce in this area, the Indian was reluctant to trade, but Hunt continued to negotiate ineffectually until he finally offered an old tin kettle, which was considered worthy and was accepted in trade for the horse. The next day, the men spent quite some time redistributing their loads, placing increasing weight on the horse. Onward they traveled, and Hunt was able to buy another horse on November 19th. He bought the horse so that he could ride, trading a tomahawk, knife, fire steel, and some beads and gartering for it. Now here I have to admit that I'm a bit troubled by this deal. I'm a firm believer that the leader should be the first to suffer the hardships of the followers, and that if all can't ride, the leader shouldn't ride. Although I've been impressed with his leadership thus far, this is one circumstance in which I disagree with what Hunt did. I also disagree with his next choice, which was to follow the advice of the Indians and leave the river to follow a trail that led west across the barren landscape. He found neither water nor fuel for fires, and the men who had traveled far with little food now had no water to drink. Washington Irving relates the following: "The thirst of the Canadian voyagers became so insupportable as to drive them to the most revolting means of allaying." Now you can use your own imagination to decide what the most revolting means of allaying their thirst might be. And onward they traveled, covering 25 miles across the desert, and camping that night with no prospects for improvement the next day. Then it began to rain. The water collected in depressions and puddles, and the men drank. The rain offered enough relief that they set off early in the morning, reinvigorated by the still falling drops of water. As with all human beings, one problem, when lessened, opens the door for another problem to become most important. Now hunger became the dominant concern as the men traveled 33 miles on November 20th, nibbling on parched corn as they went. The next morning's travel brought the group to a beautiful stream flowing westward and nestled between groves of cottonwood and willow. My research tells me that Hunt was now in the vicinity of the Boise River, or at the very least a nearby stream in the area of Boise, Idaho. An Indian village sat on the banks, and all around the village grazed a large number of horses. These Indians were much better off than those poor wretches who had lived along the barren areas on the Snake River. As the party walked into the village thinking that they had found salvation in this group of natives, a new problem cropped up. One of the Indians walked up to Hunt's horse and claimed it as his own, stolen from him at some point in the not-too-distant past. Many other members of the tribe confirmed that this horse was indeed the property of the Indian, and Hunt, who tried and failed to buy the horse again, handed him over to the rightful owner. They camped in the village that night and once again ate fish and dog. This was becoming a routine diet, and it did provide a pleasant evening and a full belly. The next morning, the party continued along the stream on a rainy day, only making 10 miles before stopping to trade at another village. Here they acquired fish and dogs, and two men, one of whom was Pierre Dorian, also traded buffalo robes for horses. Dorian's wife and two small children, 2 and 4 years old, had suffered over the same rough country as the men, but the woman was very pregnant as well, and one can only imagine the difficulties she endured to keep moving forward. In doing so, she had earned the everlasting respect of the white men with whom she traveled. As always, Hunt continued his quest for information. He needed to know where he was and how to get to his destination, but communicating with the local tribes was extremely difficult. Of course, there was no common language, and even the sign language of the plains, with which men could communicate in extreme detail for hours, didn't translate well with these tribes. The one piece of information he could glean was that the Great River was still far to the north. Try as he might, he couldn't communicate well enough to learn anything about the routes and the distances involved. Continuing west and following the Boise, Hunt and his men traveled about 40 miles to the junction of the Boise and the Snake Rivers near modern-day Boise River, Oregon. Looking ahead, they saw snow-covered mountains representing an enormous barrier, difficult to cross this late in November. 3 more days of rough travel included crossing 2 small rivers and traveling 70 miles, excellent distances considering the circumstances. As they traveled, their already meager food supplies were depleting very quickly. Soup was their primary food source. Now imagine, if you will, walking 35 miles per day across this rough landscape with only a small portion of soup to sustain you. The typical 10,000 steps per day doesn't sound like much when we consider that the average number of steps per mile is somewhere around 2,000. These weary travelers were walking about 70,000 steps per day, burning about 100 calories per mile. They were certainly losing any fat that they might have had, but it's likely that they were lean when this portion of the journey started, and they were burning away lean mass by this point. On November 27th, Hunt and his men walked into the mountains near modern-day Brownlee, Oregon. They were still following the Snake River, and they had no way of knowing how far out of their way this path would lead them. Had they taken the Powder River up the valley near Baker City, Oregon, and across the Blue Mountains, they could have arrived at Umatilla Landing on the Columbia after about 140 miles of travel. But navigating the Snake to the Columbia would have resulted in traveling almost 400 total miles across some very rugged, almost impassable country. Hunt didn't know any of this at this point, though, and he also didn't know that they were headed into a country so rough that it has earned a name that describes the difficulty of traveling through it: Hell's Canyon. Hunting was not possible here, and it became necessary to kill one of the precious horses to feed everybody. In his journal, Hunt says that his men, and I quote, "find the meat very good, and indeed, so should I, were it not for the attachment I have for the animal." After traveling 10 miles the next day, they stumbled upon 2 Shoshone lodges. These poor people were barely scraping by themselves and had just killed 2 of their own horses for food. They lived on seeds which, according to Hunt, resembled hemp seed, collected from a weed and pounded fine, just as we might mill oats to make flour. Hunt bought a bag of their flour and small cuts of meat from the horses, which he described as fat and tender. I marvel at this. These people were nearly starving themselves. What could possibly be valuable enough to motivate them to trade off their already scarce food supply to these white men? After all, when you're hungry, nothing else really matters. Yet Hunt had stumbled upon something more important than food. As he spoke with the Shoshones, Hunt learned that several white men had passed going down the river in two groups, one on each side of the river. Hunt thought that these men must be Crooks and his party who had split from Hunt's group on October 9th. Better yet, he learned that Crooks still had a dog traveling with his group, which meant that they must have obtained enough food to keep them from looking to the dog as a food source. Hunt was concerned that traveling through the rugged mountains would take days, so he began to think of the difficulties of obtaining food once again. He tried to trade for a horse, but the Shoshone wouldn't accept any offers. In fact, the women began to wail and cry pitifully, obviously concerned about giving up their own scarce source of food. By this time, the Shoshone, who were likely concerned about the possibility of horse theft, were ready for Hunt and his men to move on, and they let Hunt know that in about 3 days of travel he could be through the mountains. More encouraging, in 6 days he could expect to be at the falls of the Columbia. Hunt, who seems to have been a good judge of men and a good leader, didn't believe them, clearly seeing that they simply wanted him and his men gone. Nevertheless, he wasn't really getting anywhere, and he finally decided to head downriver, come what may. For 2 days, he and his men traveled along the rocky canyon paths, unloading horses to allow them to make the passage. At times, they couldn't follow the river and had to instead climb up the rocky bluffs and make their way along as best they could over the difficult country far above the river. 2 days into this passage, the men were lucky to kill a black-tailed deer. That allowed everyone to have a decent meal for the first time in quite a while. Still, they covered 28 miles in those 2 days, an incredible feat in itself. On December 1st, they encountered snow up to the knees, making travel all the more difficult. A small beaver and some frozen blackberries, haws, and chokecherries was their food for the day. They could only manage 13 miles before they were worn out and had to camp, staying in that camp all the next day due to a snowstorm which reduced visibility to less than half a mile. Another horse had to be killed for food at this camp. The next day they traveled on through the snow and rain, making only 9 miles and unloading the horses and carrying their packs for a portion of those miles. The next morning, knowing that they couldn't stick to the river, they would instead have to ascend the bluffs, they climbed up out of the canyon and looked around. Whatever spirit of optimism they might have possessed must have died at that moment. Looking around at their 360-degree view, they saw nothing but snowy mountains, a few pines and evergreen trees, and a bleak landscape all around. They worked hard all that day, but only advanced 4 miles. Hungry, exhausted, their positive mindset certainly in peril, they were not anxious to see darkness setting in. Managing to reach a clump of pine trees, they cut some down and kindled a massive fire. This is a constant theme with anyone who has undergone cold and hunger in the wilderness. Nothing boosts the spirits like a nice fire. It must be a deep, primitive, instinctual reaction. After all, mankind can thrive in many areas of the world only because of the ability to think and shape the environment for his own needs. Shelter, clothing, and especially fire are essential. Overnight, the snow began to fall, a snowstorm that limited visibility to 100 yards. They made their way down the bluffs to the river, following the sounds of the river to keep them pointed in the right direction. A horse slipped and fell several hundred yards down the slope, carrying the packs with him, but somehow avoiding injury. Luckily, the weather at the river's edge was better, and the snow was only ankle deep. They traveled 6 miles downriver and camped again on the river's edge, and once again, with no other food available, they killed another of their horses. They were running out of horses at this point. 472 miles after leaving Cauldron Lynn, Hunt and his men found themselves in dire straits. They were traveling down an increasingly difficult river in the increasingly cold and harsh winter. In the middle of the mountains, they were no telling how many miles from their destination, and they'd no idea which route was best. This was the reality of traveling over unknown country for the first time. Everything was guesswork. Every choice a potential life-saving or life-threatening option. It was at this point, on December 6, 1811, that the group packed up and started on their daily journey, Spirits were low for understandable reasons, but things changed quickly when they saw a group of white men approaching them on the opposite bank of the river. As it turned out, this group of white men was Ramsey Crooks and the men who had accompanied him. As soon as these men approached near enough to be heard over the sounds of the river, they began asking for food. They appeared nearly starved, and Hunt quickly had his men build a canoe out of the skin of the horse which had been killed the night before, using sticks to hold the edges of the skin and making it semi-watertight. Some of the horse meat from the previous night was carried across the river in this fashion, and back across the river with the Canadian voyager came Ramsey Crooks and another Canadian named Leclerc. Hunt was dismayed at the emaciated condition of both men. As Washington Irving notes, Hunt's party had watched each other lose weight day by day, so the change was less noticeable. But seeing the severity of the changes in the physical condition of Crooks and Leclerc made everyone in Hunt's party start thinking about their own situation. If conditions downstream had led these men to this state, could any of them avoid starvation? After eating a bit, Crooks began to explain what had happened to his party since they'd started off separately on November 9th. Traveling along the south and west side of the river, his men had met very few Indians, and even those he'd met had been so poor as to provide no meaningful assistance. For the first 18 days after leaving Cauldron Lynn, each of the men had subsisted on half a meal per day. For the next 3 days they had survived on a single beaver, some wild cherries, and the soles of their old moccasins. And for the last 6 days they had eaten only one dog. They had traveled 3 days farther downriver than Hunt, but they had ultimately come to a point where the mountains were so high, the river channel so narrow, and the cliffs extending up from the river so steep and tall, they were unable to stay close to the river. At this point, the river passed through a channel 30 yards wide with tremendous rapids, making the crossing of the river seem madness. At any rate, the crossing of the river wouldn't have helped because the topography on the east bank was just as impassable. Knowing that the only way out of this predicament was through it, Crooks and his men had attempted to climb the mountains, struggling to plow through the snow for half a day until they stood high atop a mountain. As they stood there catching their breath, we can only imagine how they must have felt when they looked out. Much like the old children's song about the bear going over the mountain to see what he could see, these men only saw another mountain, and another mountain, and another mountain. They were truly in the middle of an almost impenetrable wilderness in the middle of what today is, as I mentioned earlier, known as Hell's Canyon. Starving, cold, and seeing that they had virtually no chance of making it through these mountains by following the Snake River, Crooks and his men started back upriver, retracing their footsteps. As they made their way back, they had now managed to find Wilson Price Hunt and his group. And now what? Crooks did have some additional information. He had spoken with Mackenzie's group several days earlier. Mackenzie, Reed, and the other men had been on Hunt's side of the river, and it had been impossible to cross the river at that point. They brought the news that McClellan had headed up a smaller river, hoping to encounter some flatheads on the western side of the Rockies. Mackenzie's men were a superior group of foragers and had therefore been in better condition. When Crooks last saw them, they were headed further down the Snake River. Now, I've said previously that Hunt must have been a phenomenal leader. He pushed on regardless of hardship. His men and one woman followed his lead. That's something that you can't do if you aren't a strong leader. Now he had yet another tough decision, although in my mind there really wasn't much choice. Continuing down the river was foolhardy. They would all likely die from starvation within a few days, especially when the difficulty of traveling made the requirement for high-calorie food all the more important. Hunt had only 20 men in his party. Crooks had 18 more in his party, so 40 souls depended on sound thinking and a strategy. Hunt knew that the only chance was to head back upriver and to seek out some other small Indian bands on the smaller rivers, hoping that they had some horses which could carry he and his men to the Columbia. Hunt also knew that Crooks and his men were weak. There was a real concern that none of that party would be able to keep up with Hunt's men as they made their way back out of the mountains. Several days of travel would be required just to get back to the last Indian village. Would Crooks and his men make it? Could all of Hunt's men make it? The only food for the entire group at this point was one poor, emaciated horse. But there being no alternative, Hunt knew that turning back was not only the right answer, it was the only answer. The next morning, Hunt made the announcement that he contemplated all night long. They were going to turn back. Crooks and Leclerc could not be taken back across the river because the horse-hide canoe had been lost overnight. Now Crook's men would need to travel upriver on their side of the stream while Crooks and Leclerc traveled with Hunt's party. With these plans in place, the group started back upstream. In a short time, it was clear that Crooks and Leclerc would not be able to maintain the pace. Crooks' emaciated group on the opposite shore would have been having the same issues. They'd been starving as well. They had no energy to move quickly. Hunt's men were impatient. They had miles to travel just to get back to a place where there was a remote possibility of getting food. Their ability to make it back and find food was in no way assured. Time was wasting, and they needed to go. Better to leave Crooks and Leclerc so that the rest could save themselves. But Hunt wouldn't agree to this, and so his men started to outdistance the group in ones or twos, slowly doing, individually, what they thought best, and leaving Hunt to suffer the results of his own conscience. Pierre Dorian was one of those who left, and Pierre owned the one remaining horse. He had refused to sacrifice his horse, and had instead driven it on ahead of him. With only 5 men remaining in his group, Hunt was ready to press on. The next day, a raft was made to attempt to reunite Crooks and Leclerc with their men on the opposite side of the river. After several attempts, this effort had to be abandoned, and the time and energy wasted in the effort put the group at even greater risk. They moved upstream, slowly, painfully. Hunt's remaining men now argued that they needed to move or they would all starve, and that night, one of the men was severely frostbitten in the bitter cold. Crooks became ill and was unable to travel the next day. The entire group had 3 beaver skins, not beaver skins, to be used as a source of food. Hunt decided that the only option was to quickly move upriver and insist that Dorian's horse be killed and fed to the men. Leaving 2 men to assist Crooks and Leclerc, Hunt gave them 2 beaver skins, and taking 3 men, headed out to overtake Dorian, come what may. Hunt and his 3 men traveled all day without eating, only preparing a little beaver skin to eat after camping that night. The next day, December 10th, they caught up with Dorian and the rest of the party who had been traveling ahead. Now Hunt once again proposed sacrificing Dorian's horse for the good of the men in the expedition. These men were also starving, not having eaten for 3 days. But once again, Dorian was vehemently opposed to killing his horse, and Dorian was no man to trifle with. Interestingly, even the men, who were all very hungry themselves, took the side of Dorian and the horse. If we stop to consider their rationale, it does make sense. In what is perhaps the ultimate example of delayed gratification, the men thought it best to hold the horse for as long as possible. Nobody knew when they would reach the Indian village, which might have moved in the intervening days. In fact, it's easy to think it would have moved. Remember that the tribe was concerned about having Hunt's party as visitors and wanted them to leave the village as soon as possible. I think it's likely that if I were a leader, I would have suggested moving our village to another location, and very quickly. And thus Hunt acceded, and the horse was granted a stay of execution, for the time being. The group now traveled on, but for only a short distance before they spotted a Shoshone lodge with several horses grazing around it. This lodge had not been there when they traveled downstream, and seeing this was a complete surprise to Hunt and his men. Knowing that this tribe would not want to part with their horses and would take them away at any sign of alarm, Hunt told his men to play it cool and approach quietly. Sneaking into camp, the men surprised the Indians, who ran away terrified. Now Hunt and his men took 5 horses, killed, butchered, cooked, and ate one immediately, and dispatched a man back to Crooks and his men with meat for them. When the messenger sent back with fresh meat reached Crooks' party, they quickly ate the meat, which was in no way enough food for this number of men. They even considered killing the horse the messenger had ridden in, but thought better of it and moved on to Hunt's camp, which was reached the next morning. If, like me, you remembered that Crooks and Leclerc were on the east side of the river with the remainder of Hunt's party, and that Crooks' original party of men were on the west side of the river, well, you might ask yourself, as did I, what about food for those men? And this is precisely what Crooks wanted to know when he reached Hunt's camp. He was dismayed to learn that no food had been sent to those starving men. Preparations were begun immediately to take food to them. A skin canoe was built, and kettles were filled with water and meat to cook up a stew. As the water boiled and the meat was cooked, the question of who would ferry the supplies across the Snake River was discussed. The river was narrow and deep, and nobody wanted to risk taking the food across here. As the starving men sat on the opposite bank, it was as though Hunt's men were somehow afraid of them. Try as he might, Crooks couldn't convince anyone to make the trip, and he was forced to make the attempt himself, though he was weakened from his own starvation. The Kentucky hunter, Ben Jones, finally stepped forward and crossed the river. After the meager meal had been delivered, one of the men, Jean-Baptiste Prévost, lost his grip on reality and became irrational. He ran around the riverbank, calling for the canoe to be sent back to take him away from the starving party, and saying that if he weren't brought to the other side of the river, he would lie down and die right where he was. Once again, the canoe came back across the river with Joseph Delaunay, the captain of this particular voyage, bringing back some additional meat as well. Now Prévost insisted on joining Delaunay in the canoe. Delaunay refused, and he pointed out that there was plenty of meat on the west side of the river now. Prévost, who was still delusional, insisted that the meat was uncooked and that he would die before it could be cooked. As Delaunay cast off, Prévost forced his way onto the vessel, and they set sail for the east bank. As they neared the bank, Prévost saw the meat cooking over the fire, stood up, started clapping happily, and danced around the unstable canoe with joy until it overturned, dumping both men into the river. Although it required tremendous effort, Delaunay reached the shore. But poor Prévost, so concerned that he would die of starvation that he refused to stay with the other men, was swept away downriver and drowned. Except for 2 or 3 men, Hunt sent the rest of his group upstream. Another horse was killed and the skin used to make another canoe. The canoe carried more meat across to the men on the west bank and returned with Kentuckian John Day. The once vibrant Day was also emaciated in a shadow of his former self. Crooks thought so highly of Day that he refused to leave his side, instead telling Hunt that he should catch up with the men who had moved upstream. Hunt's leadership was needed if this expedition had any chance of making it to Astoria, and Crooks knew it. And so Crooks and Canadian voyager Jean-Baptiste Dubois stayed with Day. Hunt left 2 horses and a part of the last horse that had been killed with Crooks. These men would follow, but because of their poor physical condition, at a much slower pace. The men on the other side of the river would also move slowly, but no real mention of a plan for their well-being seems to have been considered at this point. Now it's here that we need to think about the well-being of the entire expedition. Remember that the horses these men had been eating, they weren't theirs. They'd been stolen from the Shoshones who had occupied the lodge but run away when the men approached. Like you and me, those Shoshone must have been some put out that these white intruders had appropriated their horses for their own use, and it's possible that they were out recruiting assistance and attacking Hunt and his men, even as those men tried to deal with their hunger. Though Hunt had left several items in the Shoshone camp which should have been sufficient payment for the horses, he didn't know how the tribe would react. At the very least, the men of the Pacific Fur Company hadn't made friends and influenced these Shoshones in a positive way. Hunt caught the rest of his expedition later that evening, and on December 13th, they saw several Indians with 3 horses on the west side of the river. Shortly they saw the lodges they'd encountered when heading downstream. He tried and failed to trade a rifle for a horse, and ultimately had to trade a tin kettle and some beads for the animal. Cold and stormy weather prevailed for the next 2 days. Snow and icy conditions made matters worse for the men. The only thing that made travel bearable was that they were heading down into the open valley near modern-day Keating and Baker City, Oregon. Clearly, travel would be easier there. And as I read about these days of constant travel, hunger, cold, and frustration, I consider what these men must have been thinking about. Hardships encountered since they crossed the Rocky Mountains were enormous, and nobody yet knew when these hardships might end. It's one thing to endure problems when you know that there's a stopping point somewhere. You have an expiration date. When you know where you are and where you're headed, it's a much simpler thing to keep stepping forward. The unknown makes all of this a lot more difficult to deal with. We're more hesitant to step out. Are we headed in the right direction? Is there a better way? Will we encounter worse problems ahead? How many more days of this do we have to take? I would have been asking these questions, at least in my own mind, I'm certain. Now, after 20 rough days of travel down and back up the river, the expedition camped on the banks of a small stream flowing from the east, which they crossed on November 26th. They found a recently arrived village of Shoshones, 12 lodges in all, who confirmed that turning back had been the right choice. The mountains were simply impossible to cross at this time of year. Though he had saved his men, Hunt's worry now deepened for Mackenzie and the men who had passed on downriver ahead of him. Hunt followed the little stream to some Shoshone lodges where he traded for 2 horses, a dog, dried fish, roots, and dried cherries. Over the next 2 days, he spoke with the Shoshone, attempting to gather information about the best route to take and the amount of time to reach the friendly tribes on the west side of the Blue Mountains. Although the information varied, it was generally agreed that it would take about 3 weeks to reach his destination, which would certainly have been somewhere on the Columbia, perhaps in the Umatilla area. Although Hunt tried to hire guides at exorbitant prices, none would accept, simply saying that the snow in the mountains was too deep and that they would freeze. Sometimes no amount of money will make something a good deal. Hunt was urged to spend the remainder of the winter with the Shoshone and to travel when the weather improved. Hunt was at a pickle here. He was spending more money day by day, and the expedition had been traveling in one way or another since July 1810. The ensuing 18 months had resulted in numerous hardships, and now they were a few hundred miles from their destination, and he wanted to push on. He challenged the Shoshone, saying that they were lying to him about the mountains and questioned their courage. He called them women, unwilling and unable to attempt a tough journey. Finally, one man stepped up and agreed to guide the party. His price? A gun, a pistol, 3 knives, 2 horses, and a little of every trade good in the stores of the expedition. When he came back from this excursion, he would be among the wealthiest members of his tribe. December 21st marked the date that Hunt and his men left the Shoshone village. 2 other members of the tribe accompanied their guide as they traveled back to the Snake River. They searched the banks for a reed raft, a common craft made by the natives to cross the river. But finding none, Hunt had a horse killed and a horsehide canoe built. This canoe proved to be too small, and another horse was killed, the hide added to the first to make a larger vessel. The 13 men on the west bank of the river were still there, and they were able to talk back and forth across the river with Hunt. Crooks, Day, and Dubois still hadn't caught up with the men from the expedition, and the men on the opposite bank had not seen any sign of them. The horsehide canoe made only 2 passages across the Snake River that day, and that night it had to be taken apart and rebuilt to improve it. The men were not eager to make the voyage across the river. They'd seen friends washed away, and they'd come too far to believe that they were invincible. As they sat by the fire during the cold night, they surely felt some despair. They were cold, they were tired. Hard and constant work will wear anyone to the breaking point, and especially so when there isn't enough food. They'd no idea of how long they would have to travel to reach the Columbia, nor did they know how far they would have to travel to reach the coast. I marvel that more of them weren't lost. On December 23rd, the party started crossing the river. The river was icy, and breaking the ice on either bank was a necessity. After everyone made it to the west side of the river, the outlook improved, and everyone started feeling better. Sometimes small wins like this will go a long way in rebuilding optimism, and such was the case here. Crook's men on the west bank had with them a horse and dog they had picked up along the way. All the men were weak and physically diminished from the hardships they'd suffered. 3 men spoke up and let Hunt know that they wanted to stay with the Snake, the Shoshone. Hunt gave them the canoe so that they could cross the river, and he sent some trade goods which they could use to purchase whatever they might need from the tribe until Crooks came to the village. That night they camped on the Snake River for the last time. They'd spent over 800 miles on and along the river, suffering intense hardships for most of that time. As a result of these difficulties, the Canadian voyagers gave the river another name, La Maudite Rivière Enragée, the accursed Mad River, hearkening back to the days when they had first encountered the Snake River in the Jackson Valley in the shadows of the Grand Tetons, and named it the Mad River. On December 24th, they would leave it behind for good. Onward the expedition traveled to the west, heading into the Blue Mountains, the last remaining barrier before reaching the Columbia. 32 white men, 3 Indians, and Pierre Dorian's wife, unborn child, and 2 small children, all headed to they knew not what. With them were 5 worn-out horses, loaded down with the baggage they had managed to bring along. Slowly they plodded, eating horse meat, struggling to keep moving. On the 3rd day, one of the Canadians, Carrere, gave up, laid down, and simply said he couldn't go on. He and everyone else in the party was exhausted. They didn't know the term post-traumatic stress disorder, but I'm sure each member of the group suffered from it. Now it became necessary for Carrere to be mounted on one of the horses, and they were able to move on. I marvel at the mental and physical toughness and strength it would have required to get up every day and take that next step. I like to flatter myself by thinking that I would have been able to do it. I would have been up to the challenge, and it's likely that most of us would have been. After all, when you've no choice, what's left but to put one foot in front of the other? I think it must resemble the mindset of the marathon runner, though. When the body is so worn down and exhausted from exertion, the thing that keeps them moving is mental toughness. The same thing is true with brutal, hard training like the Navy SEALs might do when they have to go through their crucible, the Hell Week. The body is worn down and broken, but the mind can push beyond that. And that mental toughness is what carries through. Now, if we are honest with ourselves, you and I, we live in soft times. Things are much different today than they were for people 200 years ago. And I think the transition from our comfortable, cushy lives would be much more traumatic. But most people, even today, could find the strength to keep going, again, if they had no choice. And when I say that we live cushioned, comfy lives, I'm talking about those of us who live in developed, westernized economies. We do not live the way people would have lived 200 years ago. So I think that transition from this comfortable, cushy life would be a traumatic thing for us, but we, and most people, even today, could find the strength to keep going and would keep going if there was no alternative. December 28th, Hunt's group came to a small stream that passed north through a beautiful valley, mountains on each side. These snow-covered mountains running north and south would have to be crossed. The snow continued to fall, even in the valley, and the group traveled 21 miles on December 29th, making good time despite the weather and the poor condition of the men. On the morning of December 30th, somewhere near the current town of North Powder, Oregon, Marie Dorian went into labor. Marie, the Sioux woman who had put up with the beatings and bad treatment of Pierre Dorian, who had often carried her youngest child and her unborn baby, and who had earned the admiration of the men in the party, well, she was certainly a woman to ride the river with. She had grit, and the men in the expedition who admired her for her strength were concerned for both her and the newborn baby, especially considering the hard traveling, the cold weather, and the approaching snowy mountain passes. Pierre Dorian, on the other hand, seemed to take the new birth in stride, staying with his wife and 3 children in camp and promising to catch up to the main group later. As the men traveled on, another man, Labonte, was unable to continue and had to be placed on yet another horse. Hunt himself carried the pack that was taken from that horse, and the expedition continued into the hills. Now, let me step back for a second. Earlier, I mentioned the fact that when Hunt bought the horse to ride it himself, and all the other members of his party couldn't ride, I thought that was a bad move. Here's an example of Hunt practicing leadership in a way that I would wholeheartedly agree with. He carried the pack that was taken off the horse so that Labonte could ride the horse. That's leadership, folks. That's interesting to me. When the stream they were following turned up into the mountains now, the men continued along the valley floor, finally finding themselves in what must have been called, what we today would call the Grand Ronde, in the vicinity of modern-day La Grande, Oregon. This is a beautiful valley, and although it's set between snow-capped mountains all around it, the climate in the valley is much more moderate. There was no snow there at all in that valley at that time of year. In addition to the break in the weather, the men saw that the valley also contained 6 lodges of the Shoshone tribe, with horses and dogs scattered across the valley floor. Eager to trade with the tribe, the men quickly traded a rifle, a musket, a tomahawk, a tin kettle, and some ammunition for 4 horses, 3 dogs, and some roots. The men promptly killed some of the animals and quickly prepared and ate the meat. For men who had been so long without plentiful food, this respite must have made quite a difference in their outlook. The next morning, Pierre Dorian and his family arrived in the camp. Marie, seemingly unfazed by the birth of the baby and subsequent travel, carried the newborn baby in her arms, her 2-year-old wrapped in a blanket hanging from her side, and she rode the pitiful horse that Pierre had refused to sacrifice earlier right into camp. Their entrance marked the end of 1811, for the next day was January 1st, 1812. When New Year's Day dawned, Hunt was encouraged to take a day of rest. The Canadian voyageurs, for whom the celebration of the New Year is a favorite, wanted to enjoy the day. They wanted to rest, and they wanted to celebrate. Who could resist? Certainly not Hunt, and the day was spent dancing and enjoying a feast of dog and horse, proving that even in the face of harsh adversity, the human spirit can remain unconquered. Having rested 2 days, the men resumed their journey on January 2nd. The Shoshone pointed out the pass over the mountains that the men would need to cross and told Hunt that there shouldn't be much snow now to contend with. They assured him that in 3 days he would arrive in the area of the Columbia and the friendly tribes that were there. Hunt, having heard many of these false assurances in the past, was unwilling to believe what he was told, but he had no choice but to push on and see what lay ahead. 5 days of travel followed as the party crossed the valley. Note, 5 days of travel after he was told it was only 3 more. He was right to be suspicious of being promised that he could be there in 3 days. The rocky ridges and the jumble of fallen trees in the forest made climbing those mountains very difficult. Often they were in knee-deep snow and occasionally found themselves in drifted snow up to their waists. As they topped each mountain's crest, they saw other mountains ahead of them, offering really no psychological respite from the hardships of that journey. But there was a noticeable change on January 6th, when after cresting one mountain ridge, they entered a milder climate on the western front of the range. The cloud cover broke, the snow decreased, and they began to see an open plain at the foot of the mountain. Imagine the feeling of exhilaration the men experienced when they saw this plain spread before them. In Washington Irving's words, they hailed it as the poor Israelites hailed the first glimpse of the Promised Land. And I think it was likely that they were in the vicinity of Dead Man Pass, an area on Interstate 84 where today you can come down out of the Blue Mountains and look out across the vast Columbia River plain. If you haven't been there, I encourage you to take a trip and take in this impressive sight. Go, or at least go out on Google Earth and pull up this area and take a look across this beautiful area called the Columbia River Plain, looking from the Blue Mountains out across toward the Columbia River. Now Hunt and his men pushed on through the narrow canyons and followed a stream that seemed to lead them towards the open country down below. They encountered black-tailed deer, and they found plentiful tracks of horses ridden by Indians who were out hunting. In his haste to make it down onto the plain, Hunt pushed pretty hard, harder than many of his weakened men could stand, and they began to fall behind. When camp was finally made that night, some of those men didn't come in at all. In another sad chapter for Hunt's group, Pierre and Marie Dorian's newborn child also died during that day's march. The next morning, the party departed camp early. They didn't wait for the stragglers to make their way into camp, but instead pushed on, relentlessly seeking the plains, friendly tribes, and the Columbia River. Up ahead they saw an Indian village, and although it was located some distance away in the center of the valley below, Hunt could tell that there were numerous lodges and hundreds of horses grazing all around. The valley was lush and green, and all appearances were that this was assuredly a land of plenty, in contrast to the lean land they had just crossed. Now the men redoubled their efforts, their pace quickening as they limped their way as fast as possible to the village. Soon they made their way into what proved to be a village of what Washington Irving called Sayatogas. My research tells me that there was no such tribe, and that Irving likely used a term that had been misapplied. This tribe might have been Walla Walla, Cayuse, Nez Perce, also called Nez Perce, who called themselves Nimipu, the Umatilla, or maybe another Shoshone band. Regardless of which tribe it was, this tribe had ample supplies, and it looked as though the starving times were now gone. This village consisted of 34 lodges, absolutely, without a doubt, the largest village that Hunt and his men had seen really since crossing the mountains. These Indians were better off than those encountered back along the Snake River, better clothed, each with a buffalo or deerskin robe, deerskin hunting shirt and leggings. Somewhere close to 2,000 horses filled this valley, a far cry from the days when Pierre Dorian's single horse was thought to be the last-ditch emergency food supply. Once Hunt entered the lodges, it became clear that commerce, trade with white men, had been a part of this tribe's past. Inside he found brass kettles, axes, copper tea kettles, and other manufactured items, all certainly obtained through the trade network established on the Pacific coast. A few quick questions also informed Hunt that the Columbia was only 2 days' travel ahead. Even more incredible, he was told that several white men had recently traveled down the Columbia. Surely these were men from his expedition. At last, Hunt could feel as though he was approaching the home stretch of the journey. Again, I imagine how these men and one woman must have felt. The hardships had been tremendous, the suffering almost intolerable. Several men had lost their lives, and several others had ventured into the wilderness to suffer who knew what. All had come closer to starvation than they wanted to contemplate. Relief might not be a strong enough word for how they felt now. The stragglers, left behind in the haste to make it to the plain below, slowly drifted into camp, with one exception. Canadian voyager Carrier still hadn't arrived. He had last been seen riding behind one of the snake men near the last camp. Hunt now once more began to turn his mind to food and provisions for his men. Despite the euphoria of reaching this camp, the trip was not over, and he had to get supplies. He was only able to buy some roots and some poor quality venison. The next day he bought a mare and a colt, both of which were quickly killed and eaten. Now it was possible to sit in the village and eat as much as you could, and many of the men did just that. Some ate so much that they got sick. Many were weak and lame after the torturous journey. Slowly they began to recover. Luckily, with so many horses available, the trade value of a horse was much less than back along the Snake River. Here, a blanket, a knife, or a half-pound of blue beads could buy a horse, and so each man was able to secure a horse for his own transport on the next phase of the journey. Hunt noticed that this tribe was different than those he had encountered thus far on his journey. Where every other tribe, from the banks of the Missouri to the Snake River Plain, had counted on dogs as a staple of their food supply, this tribe ate neither dogs nor horses. They wouldn't allow raw dog or horse meat in their lodges. They hunted deer on horseback, surrounding them and driving them into a circle. Like many of the Plains tribes, they were excellent horsemen, managing their bows and arrows with ease while mounted. Though they had many of the accoutrements of civilization, they continued to live an uncivilized lifestyle. They had axes, but still used stone mallets and elk horn wedges to split wood. They had brass kettles, but often used vessels made of woven willows to carry and boil water. Hunt was witnessing that strange transition between the Stone Age man and the advanced world of the Industrial Revolution. After 2 or 3 days in camp, Hunt sent 2 men back on horses to look for Carrier, who had not caught up with the party. The lodges of the Snake tribe were now gone, and the men were unable to find Carrier anywhere. Assuming the worst, the men thought him surely dead, and they returned to Hunt's camp. As it turns out, the river upon which Hunt was camped was the Umatilla, the same name given to a local tribe, and perhaps this tribe, the tribe that Hunt was encamped with, were also Umatilla. That part's really unclear from the accounts I've read. The Umatilla teemed with beaver, a good sign for fur-seeking men, and the expedition moved their camp downriver twice, ultimately moving 30 miles downstream. A heavy rain flooded the river during this time, making them abandon one of their camps and costing them 3 horses which had been staked out on low ground and could not be saved. After more conversations with the Indians, Hunt believed that the white men who had traveled down the river had been McClellan and Mackenzie. The numbers and details matched, and Hunt began to feel hope that these men and those with whom they traveled had survived the journey. The tribe also told a story of white men who came and traded with them, speaking of Kikush and Jacquin, who brought tobacco and smoked with them. It was said that Jacquin had a house on the Columbia. The Canadians thought it possible that they spoke of Jacquin Finley, a Northwest Company clerk, and that the house must be one of the Northwest Company trading posts. Now the tribe had new trading partners, and they were excited for the men to return on their first trading excursion back up the Columbia. In fact, they promised to collect beaver skins in preparation for the return of the Pacific Fur Company traders. On January 20th, Hunt and his men departed, continuing to the west, much like Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery had done 7 years earlier. The next day, the men saw the Great Columbia for the very first time. Although the journey wasn't yet over, had we been there that day to hear the shouts of joy and excitement, we might have thought that this was the destination. They had left the Arikara village on the Missouri 6 months earlier, and in those 6 months they had lived a lifetime of adventure. In this case, adventure is just another word for bad decisions and trouble. There's an old saying that good decisions come from experience, and experience comes from bad decisions. Perhaps it applies here, but it's more likely that Hunt and his men did the best they could. To second-guess them now from the comfort of my office chair in front of my computer, well, that just isn't fair. I couldn't expect to have done better, and most likely not nearly so well. By their own count, they had traveled 1,751 miles since leaving the Arikara villages, miles filled with a lot of hardship and a lot of suffering. Now that they had reached the Columbia, all was not peaches and cream for Hunt and his men. Upon reaching the banks of the Columbia, they found a tribe of Indians which Irving calls the Apaches, described as being a miserable horde, scantily dressed, wearing animal skins, camped in lodges shaped like tents. The women slept in pits hollowed out beside the lodges and lined with grass mats. The tribe lived on fish and used the trunks of pine trees hollowed out by fire as canoes. Despite their desperate appearance, this tribe had large stores of dried salmon and plenty of fresh salmon from the Umatilla and Columbia River confluence. Hunt and his men were able to trade for some of these fish to take downstream with them. The road downstream was on the north side of the Columbia, which the expedition had to cross. Afterwards, they continued downstream for 5 or 6 days. During this time, they traveled slowly because of horses that strayed and Indians who tried to steal them. Passing by other tribes, they often bought fish and dogs, and at one place they tried to buy a supply of recently killed elk and deer, but couldn't because of the high price. They would continue to subsist on dog, but as Washington Irving points out, by now, they had begun to think of dog as a good meal, much better than horse. As they traveled down the river, they continued to hear of the white men they thought might be McClellan and Mackenzie. They learned that the men had lost many of their possessions when their canoe overturned, and so they were reminded that even the process of traveling down the Columbia had to be handled carefully. Luckily, the mild weather allowed them to travel without any negative impacts from storms or low temperatures. Slowly, they made their way down the plain until about 60 miles below the Umatilla confluence. Here they began to encounter the Columbia River Gorge, the channel that the river has cut through the rocky cliffs, dropping down in elevation through several rapids and falls along the way. Just as the landscape was changing, so were the tribes they encountered. Here the tribes were notably well off, better dressed, and clearly having access to more food sources. These tribes had also experienced dealing with white men more frequently. Hunt noted that in addition to being better off and leading a more leisurely lifestyle, these tribes were also much more arrogant and demanding. This will bear remembering as we travel on down the Columbia. Now Hunt also learned something of the seagoing component of the Pacific Fur Company. The tribe spoke of a number of white men who had built a large house surrounded by palisades at the mouth of the river. Though none of these tribes had actually seen Fort Astoria, they'd heard about it. The presence of a trading post at the mouth of the river sent shockwaves up and down the river and its tributaries, which was precisely the point. The trading post needed customers and suppliers. These tribes were both. And Hunt also learned that the men at Fort Astoria had been eagerly anticipating the arrival of his overland party, and, owing to the lateness of his arrival, they feared that all might be lost. On January 31st, Hunt's expedition arrived at the falls of the Columbia and set up camp near the village of the Wishram, near the head of the Long Narrows, a most dangerous stretch of the river. To understand the importance of this stop, we have to first understand who the Wishram were. This tribe had made a profession of catching and processing fish for commercial purposes. They stored these fish, holding them for their customers who could come from the coast and from farther inland as well. The tribes from the mouth of the Columbia brought coastal and saltwater fish, roots, berries, and wapato, a root very similar to a potato, as well as trinkets and other goods from the coast. The tribes from the Rocky Mountains brought horses, beargrass, quamish or camas, a root crop that was almost as widely traded as salmon. The Plains tribes also brought buffalo robes and other products from inland. The Wishram fishermen were the middlemen, the intermediaries in this trade network. In this way, the goods from the coast wound up far inland, and goods from the mountains wound up at the coast. The pounded salmon, which could be stored for long periods of time and transported great distances, were often the currency of trade. Like all traders the world over, the Wishram had become shrewd. They drove hard bargains, but Hunt noted that they were not in the least inclined to honesty. Being the successful merchants they were, the Wishram also lived more sumptuously. Their houses were made of wood, sloped roofs, sunken floors with an entrance which required one to crawl through, possibly intended to help with defense of the house. Loopholes in the walls allowed arrows to be fired from inside the house, and 2 or 3 families lived in each structure. Sleeping arrangements along the walls were reminiscent of berths on a ship, and took up about half of the building, the other half being used as a warehouse to store dried fish. In addition to being a clearinghouse for trade goods, Wishram was also a clearinghouse for vital intelligence about events in the area. Hunt now learned of David Stewart's trading post on the Okanagan River, and here he also heard of Mr. McKay, a chief among the white men, and the great house he built at the mouth of the river. He learned that McKay had sailed north to trade with other tribes up the coast, and he learned of the demise of the Tonkin and Mr. McKay with it. When he asked for more information, he was told that the natives in Clayoquot Sound had lashed their canoes to the Tonkin and had fought until they killed him and everyone on the ship. The word-of-mouth communication network proved pretty accurate, but failed to bring to light the final destruction of the Tonkin when the powder magazine was blown up by Mr. Lewis, the ship's clerk. Knowing now that it was possible to navigate the Columbia from the Long Narrows to the mouth of the river, Hunt began to search for canoes, but was unable to find anything above the Narrows. Continuing on downstream overland, the expedition camped on the north bank of the river and was soon surrounded by a number of Indians who loitered in the neighborhood searching for whatever they could pick up, unnoticed. Luckily, the camp guards were accustomed to being ever alert, and nothing substantive was taken. Now the Indians changed tactics and entered the camp, fully dressed in their warrior finery. They were painted and dressed for battle, armed with lances, bows, arrows, and scalping knives. This group told Hunt that 30 or 40 men were coming from a village downriver to attack the camp. But, being the dedicated friends of the whites that they were going to stay and help defend he and his men from these attackers. Hunt played the part coolly, offering them a pipe to smoke when they'd finished outlining their plans, but no more. Then he put everyone in the camp on alert, stationed guards in different areas, and told each person to watch inside the camp, as well as out. As I recall the fate of the Tonkin, which we discussed thoroughly in Episode 4, Hunt's wisdom and leadership skills are even more evident. The Tonkin met her fate because, much like the Trojan horse, the enemy was able to get inside the wire, or in this case on board the ship, in sufficient strength to overwhelm the defenders. Hunt wisely knew that he had potential enemies in his camp, and that the only path to safety was to be prepared to defend against everyone, both inside and outside the camp. After seeing Hunt's preparation, the warriors soon left. So much for staying close and defending against the attackers. But it wasn't long before they returned with a single man, all decked out in his war-making finery, whom they announced as the chief of the approaching attackers. Being a peaceful man, this chief had managed to talk his warlike tribe out of attacking the white men. After making the announcement, the warriors stopped talking, waiting for the offer of reward that they expected to receive. Instead, Hunt pulled out the peace pipe and again smoked it with the pacifist chief and the other warriors. But he never offered anything in the way of gift or compensation. Hunt saw several canoes in the area and attempted to purchase them. He found the tribe less willing to trade them than to steal whatever they wanted, and despite an active and constant vigilance, things did start disappearing from his camp, including several horses. Interestingly enough, among those stolen was Pierre Dorian's long-suffering horse, stolen while tethered in his camp he had made away from the main body of Hunt's group. After several days of negotiations, Hunt was able to buy enough canoes to continue downriver via the water route. Although he was more than ready to leave this tribe behind, heavy headwinds kept Hunt in the Wishram area until February 5th. After setting off downriver, the group still had to fight headwinds and storms, but the ever-flowing Columbia carried the expedition toward their destination inexorably. After a portage around the Grand Rapid of the Columbia, Hunt and his wayward travelers finally rounded a bend in the river and spotted Fort Astoria on the banks on February 15th. Hunt, his men, one woman, and 2 children had traveled for 11 months over virtually unexplored territory, often with no information on what to expect ahead. These pilgrims had to feel excitement, joy, and a tremendous relief to see the Palisades ahead, a sleek sailing ship anchored in the bay, and other members of the Pacific Fur Company, who would soon joyfully announce their arrival, moving about the fort. The Canadian voyagers pulled with renewed energy heading across the bay, while members of the settlement poured out and down to the river's edge in excitement. Some of the first people they saw when they pulled to shore were Reed, McClellan, and Mackenzie, and the men who had split from the expedition at Cauldron Lynn. This party had made it to Astoria a month earlier, almost starving to death in the process, and giving up on ever seeing Hunt and his men alive again as the days passed. The Canadian voyagers loudly called out to each other, hugging and kissing, so happy were they to be reunited on these distant shores. If you've ever been with a group of like-minded people suffering through some hardship, you know that the bond that is created is incredibly strong. In today's world, business leaders try to fabricate these sorts of team-building situations, but they could never match the real hardships encountered by the members of Hunt's expedition, let's say. Another common aspect of living through this sort of hardship is recounting the stories for everybody to hear. The Plains tribes did this when their warriors came back celebrating victory or a successful hunt, and spent the night retelling of their exploits for every member of the tribe to hear. Huntsmen soon began the process of unpacking what they'd been through as well. The separate tales from each group were laid out, starting from the time they parted way back on the Snake River. Interestingly, modern therapeutic methods include getting together with other people who've had similar experiences and talking about them. It's a way to cope, to decompress, to reduce the severity of the PTSD that might occur. These people needed the therapy, and we still need to hear the complete story. So here are some of the details that they would have spoken about. John, Reed, Mackenzie, and McClellan each had started off in different directions, searching for whatever they might find that could help the entire expedition make it to Astoria. But we also remember that each of these men and each of these groups were told that if they didn't find something that could assist the entire expedition, they were to make the best of it and head for Astoria on their own. In fact, I think I called it a "you are on your own" moment. And each of these groups truly were. They each wandered for several days separately, finding no native tribes and securing no food or assistance. But they finally came back together farther downstream on the Snake. Now, the reunited party included Reed, McClellan, Mackenzie, and 8 men, mostly Canadian voyagers. After discussing things briefly, they all agreed that they would be worse off to turn around and try to go back to hunt than to simply press on. So they did. And they knew that they would all starve, and soon, if they didn't quickly pass through this barren country. So they did. Somehow these men had traveled all the way down the Snake River through Hell's Canyon and to the confluence of the Snake and Columbia, relatively unscathed. During their travels, they frequently suffered from thirst, not being able to climb down to the river's edge. How difficult it must be to see the river running hundreds of feet below at the bottom of a cliff while suffering from extreme thirst. I liken it to the passage in Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in which the sailors are on board a ship, suffering from extreme thirst, unable to drink any of the water that is all around them. The line goes, "Water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink." Luckily, the men were able to find rainwater collected in hollows among the rocks, just as huntsmen had done earlier during that dry portion of their trip. And at times it appears that they drank their own urine to stay alive, just as we've heard talked about before. Still they traveled. Finding no game, they were continuously hungry, and still they traveled. They survived on beaver skin, slowly dragging themselves along step by step, mentally staying focused on making that next step. They were stopped by a fierce snowstorm, sheltered under a rock outcropping, ready to give up and accept their fate. And it was at this critical point when McClellan looked up and saw a bighorn sheep sheltered on the hill above him. In better condition than his companions, McClellan managed to climb up the hill and get close enough to bring down the sheep on the spot with one shot. Now in this he was fortunate because he didn't have the strength to follow it if he'd only wounded the animal. And he was also fortunate because now he was able to roll the animal down the hill to his comrades. Soon they cut it up and made soup from the bones. Showing the restraint of the wise, they held the meat back so that they could eat it in the future. Reinvigorated by their bone broth, they traveled on, but met with a repeat of their hardships frequently. It's likely that a larger party just simply would not have survived. After 21 days of work and difficult travel, they exited the mountains and arrived on the Lewis River, today's Clearwater River, near Clarkston, Washington, and Lewiston, Idaho. Here they were able to buy 2 canoes, and after paddling down to the confluence with the Columbia River, they ultimately made their way to Astoria, arriving worn and dressed in rags, all the worse for wear. The only leading member of the party not present now was Ramsey Crooks, left back on the Snake River with John Day and Jean-Baptiste Dubois. Given the weakened state of all 3 men, there was little hope that they could have survived to make it to Astoria. Despite their sadness about the apparent loss of Crooks and the others, a celebration was warranted. Colors were hoisted, guns fired, and everyone had a feast of fish, beaver, and venison. Given how these men had lived for the last 11 months, this must have felt like heaven on earth. And in the words of Washington Irving, a genial allowance of grog was issued to increase the general animation, and the festivities wound up, as usual, with the grand dance at night by the Canadian voyagers. Hunt's expedition had traveled nearly 3,500 miles across the continent. They'd seen things no other white man had seen and been places no other white man had been. They'd suffered mightily. They'd lost men and one baby. And they triumphed, although the loss of Ramsay Crooks and John Day was certainly difficult to swallow. Now that the seagoing and overland parties of the Pacific Fur Company were reunited, it was time to start putting together the strategy for Fort Astoria and the execution of John Jacob Astor's grand vision for the Pacific Fur Company. But, as we've seen countless times, just as things seem to finally be going well, a problem is about to pop up on the horizon. In the year of 1812, the big problem facing these men would not be traveling across the continent. It wouldn't be starvation or freezing weather or the aggressive Indian tribes along the way. No, rather than these problems, the men would instead be dealing with the threat of a British attack on Fort Astoria. The War of 1812 would result in significant challenges for and changes in Astor's vision for a global trade network. But that's another story, and one we will tell in Episode 8 of the Blood and Leather Podcast. Well, folks, I always hate to wrap these up because the stories are just so fascinating to me, but we've come to a good breaking point. And this one's been pretty long. It's about double what I normally do in a podcast. I normally try to stick to about an hour. So we've got to wrap up Episode 7. I wanted us to see Hunt pulling it safely into Astoria with his battered expedition before we wrapped up this portion of the story. Now the Pacific Fur Company is going to face the challenges I spoke about earlier, including sending another overland party back to St. Louis with news of the events. Stick with me for the next episode of this story, and you'll hear what happened on the way back across the continent. Now, that will not nearly be as lengthy because the trip back wasn't nearly as lengthy, but there are still lots of elements that make for an interesting tale as we go back. For me, as always, researching and writing this episode has been a labor of love. I enjoy every minute of it, and I hope that my enthusiasm for the people, the places, the events, I hope that that shows, and I hope that the legacy that these people left is appreciated. I hope that you can see that we share this history together, you and I, and their work led to the settlement of the nation, and the outcomes of what they did are still felt today. But before I forget it, I'd like to take a moment to ask you to support a wonderful free internet resource. The Internet Archive, a nonprofit which can be accessed at archive.org, houses a wealth of information in many forms. I've enjoyed finding and reading many books about the fur trade and the men who risked so much to venture into the wilderness. Now, most of those books I wouldn't have had access to individually, at least not in my area. I would have had to spend a lot of time looking for them, perhaps buying them. I probably could have checked some out at the library, but not as many as I would have liked. I have many more to read and tons of them saved on the Internet Archive, just waiting for me to have the time to dig in and share those stories as well. None of those would be possible, not even remotely, without archive.org. So if you don't mind, head over and make a small donation to their cause. Now, I'm going to wrap this episode up, and I always like to say that if you've enjoyed the podcast, I'd really like to ask you to share, subscribe, follow, leave a review, interact in some form or fashion. Send me an email. I do have a Patreon page which you can subscribe to for a small donation each month. I'm trying to remember to go back and add some resources there that can add some value as well. So I'll be trying to continually add something to that. But your listening alone is much appreciated, and I hope that you've enjoyed the story as I've told it here. Any support means more to me than you know, even if it's just listening to the podcast. That's a big help. I can always be reached at bloodandleather@gmail.com, and let me know if you have any questions or comments. Again, I'm Tim Carter, the creator, writer, and host of the Blood and Leather Podcast, and until I see you again, endeavor to persevere.